Hi, so for our food commercial project, we looked at a McDonald's commercial and an Olive Garden commercial.
Yeah, so I'll quickly walk us through what we were looking at in both of the commercials, and kind of how they managed to convey this smell and taste of the food, through visual and auditory stimuli. So the visually conveyed parts, we were looking at really slow imaging in the McDonald's commercial over really brightly colored and high definition videos of the food. So there was a lot of focus on the details of the food, such as the like elasticity of the cheese, the spices on the food, the steam coming from it to convey the warmth of it. And we saw that in the Olive Garden commercial as well. Definitely like some slow cheese pulls, the like clear steam, and just really like high definition and like close-ups of the food, and like kind of seeing the movement of the food as people either like pressed it down or scooped it up and ate it. And so you really just see like a lot of slow, like detailed movement and like high definition, trying to convey like what that would be like if you were actually like there, maybe like sitting in front of the food. And then the auditory part of the food was also conveyed, but really more strongly in the McDonald's commercial. The Olive Garden commercial had like music playing over it. So I think they mostly relied on visual stimuli, which was clear because they panned through multiple dishes. But the McDonald's commercial actually like really heavily relied on auditory cues. They had like a really like intense cracking of an egg and like sizzling on a pan. And then you even hear like the sound of the wrapper as like someone picks it up and kind of like the pull of the cheese. And so they really like highly focus in on those like food sounds, trying to like make it seem almost as if you're like in the room as the food's being made. And I feel like that all contributes to like feeling like, oh, I can imagine like what it would be like if I was in the room, and I have all these memories associated with those sounds and those like sights that like give me the taste and smell, even though I can't taste and smell it technically.
Yes, I definitely agree. I would say that there are a couple techniques that each ad used. Personally, for me in the McDonald's advertisement, I think something that really stood out to me was the auditory stimuli. So the McDonald's ad used this like slow, like godly kind of music over the visual stimuli. So this music definitely made me as a viewer pay more attention to this one object on the screen, and I also inevitably kind of connected that music to this one object on the screen. So now I'm associating this McDonald's sandwich with resembling something that's godlike, making the food more tempting to me as well. And then with the Olive Garden advertisement, I thought that one technique that they used was similar to McDonald's, where they focused on one object throughout each shot. So in each kind of plate of food that they focused on, they made sure to slowly focus on the way maybe the food wrapped around the fork, or the way the pasta kind of like melted off of the shrimp. And so by focusing on one object at a time, it definitely made the food more tempting to me, as I only had to pay attention to a single object at a time. So I would say that these features that Kendall and I, and these techniques that we talked about, definitely relate to a lot of what was learned in class about the perception of smell, taste, and flavor. So we know that all of these three different things stimulate some part of our human system. So the perception of a smell occurs when substances in the air maybe pass through the nose and stimulate our olfactory nerve. However, in this case, we didn't even get to smell it, but I still felt like those parts of my body were being activated. The experience of taste definitely occurs when the taste buds in your mouth respond to substances that are dissolved in your saliva. Once again, this was completely visual, but I still felt like I could taste the McDonald's sandwich or the pasta and shrimp in my mouth. And we also know that the four basic tastes are salty, sweet, sour, and bitter. And so even if we are just perceiving these stimuli and not tasting or smelling it, these same kind of feelings still arise.
And then Nick, I think if you want to share about your thoughts,
Sure.
we're
Are we
talking
already
a
on the
little bit.
floor? Yeah. Okay. Uh, yeah, I think that with the subjectivity of perception, something that I found interesting with the McDonald's one is that I found the initial part that you both mentioned, that there was a lot of motion and audio going on the entire time because they can't convey taste as well. But the second the egg transforms into the sandwich, for me, it becomes a lot less appealing, uh, which kind of shows some of the subjectivity of it. Because I imagine for a large percentage of their target audience, that's the ideal, pretty much. And yeah, I don't know. For me, the as soon as they do the like the wrapper noise and like the breading and all that, I find that a lot less appealing. But when like the egg cracking audio and such, like I have a lot more of a positive association with that. And as for the Olive Garden, something you notice, especially in that commercial, is that there's motion throughout the entire thing, not just with camera pans, but they're deliberately moving pretty much all of the food at some point. And I think that's intended generally to convey texture. You can especially see this with like the cheeses and the pastas and such. But even like the salad in the background, they're putting the dressing on the salad as the camera pans across. Like that was the pretty much the only clever movement you could do with a salad besides like tossing it in the air and having the leaves float down a little more slowly. So throughout you have just a lot of other senses going on. I think generally to convey sort of the weight of the food, the texture, pretty much trying to tell you what the mouthfeel is like without being able to show that to you directly. And I think that right there is where a lot of the subjectivity comes in. I'm personally not a big fan of shrimp either. So that slide in Olive Garden is a little bit less appealing to me. But I think for various people, what sounds and sights are more appealing, it really is subjective. Personally, I also don't like the sound of people eating food. And I noticed that outside of like chip commercials where they have to emphasize the crunch, you very rarely see people eating like really close up or with a lot of audio. You might see people like taking a small bite of something and smiling about it, but you tend not to see that as much because I think a lot of other people also don't like the audio or visual of people eating. So they've kind of worked to try to convey the food in the most appealing way. And although there's some levels of subjectivity, they try to please as much of the audience as possible with what they're selling. And then as for the whether or not these commercials would be successful in other cultures, I'd say yes. I think it just depends on the type of food people are used to, especially with things like the ground meat in the McDonald's food and the cheeses. That really just is a bit more culturally dependent. But bread is a pretty common staple in a lot of places, as is salads, and a ton of cultures eat eggs. So a lot of those are more of the crowd pleasers. As for the Egg McMuffin, I guess nowadays that's become more common in places, but that's, I'd say historically speaking, a fairly recent development. So nowadays, I'd say that's a little bit more of an easy one to apply to multiple different cultures, but in the past that might not have worked as well. So lucky for McDonald's, they've expanded globally. As for Olive Garden, I think that just the fact that they have such a variety of foods that they're showing, some of that is going to be effective to pretty much all audiences. So I think that one's successful as well.
So I'm just going to wrap it up. So we chose these two commercials because we felt that they successfully stimulated the viewer's senses. Both really relied on the visual aspects of the food, with an emphasis being placed on factors like cheese and steam that are indicative of comfort foods and are widely considered really delicious meals. There were also various auditory stimuli that aided in the experience of the commercial and a desire to try the foods that were being conveyed. And as mentioned before, the McDonald's commercial had sizzling sounds while intriguing music played in the background. And like we learned in class with the mini demonstration where our classmates were blindly smelling food, many senses are involved in the perception of smell and taste as well as flavor. While blindfolded, our classmates were unable to correctly identify really common foods. And in these commercials, although we were unable to actually taste the foods, Olive Garden and McDonald's tried to play on our visual and auditory senses in order to stimulate a desire in us as the audience to taste and smell the food in real life and then purchase their products. And further, because we all have presumably tasted or experienced the flavor of these foods, or at least ones that are similar to them, by showing them in as much detail as the commercials did, our memories of sensory experiences with these foods were triggered, and we were able to imagine the smells and flavors of the foods portrayed on screen. So by utilizing auditory auditory and visual stimuli. The commercials were able to play on our various senses and food memories, and they successfully made the audience crave the food or at least have some sense of the smell and flavor of the food.